program in a series we've run this semester called New Approaches to City Planning and Slum Upgrading. Our speakers tonight come from far and near. Professor AbdouMaliq Simone has come to us from Australia. A long trip, we thank you for making the journey to be with us tonight. And our very own Rosalind Fredericks, who's come from across the square, a professor at NYUAD. Professor Simone has, I was drawn to his work by reading his most recent book, which the title of his books I'll mention in a moment, but as I had a chance to look at his background, I was intrigued by his formation. So if you'll forgive me, I'd like to draw out what I think is an extremely interesting educational path, and I'll mention it for Rosalind as well, because for me it signals that the interest in the city is rooted in so many different disciplines which combine in interesting ways. In any event, Professor Simone studied psychology and social theory as an undergraduate. He received his PhD in social clinical psychology, and then did 2 postdoctoral fellowships, one in social community psychiatry with project work in ethnopsychiatry in Mauritania, and then a second postdoc in African urban economic development. He is now an honorary professor at a very interesting research institute, the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, and he is a professor in the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths College, University of London. His publications include a book of 1994 published by the University of Chicago Press entitled In Whose Image? Political Islam and Urban Practices in Sudan. It was followed in 2004 by For the City Yet to Come, Urban Change in 4 African Cities, published by Duke University Press. And then 2009 from Routledge, City Life from Jakarta to Dakar, Movements at the Crossroads. And what drew me to his work was not only the subject of his studies, these African cities, but his particular lens on them, and the kind of social patterns that he observed so acutely in the places that he studied. And then we're fortunate that Rosalind Fredericks has come to us from the University of Chicago and from Columbia, where I seem to have lost my paper with your details, but I'll see how good my memory is. Rosalind received her PhD at the University of Chicago in geography. Berkeley, sorry. But you were at the University of Chicago.
I was not, no.
Oh, forget that. What happened to my paper? Okay. Brown. Environmental studies at Brown, then geography and environment at LSE, the London School of Economics, where she received an MS, and then, as you heard, a PhD in geography at the University of California at Berkeley. Her work is on urbanism, post-colonial identities, and the economy, political economy of development in Africa. And she's now revising her dissertation for publication as a book. It is on the cultural politics of the garbage collection in Dakar. A term I learned from you yesterday was discard studies. She's now launching a new line of research into the politics of hip-hop in Dakar and the Senegalese diaspora. So Professor Simone will make a set of remarks, Professor Fredericks will respond, they'll have a bit of a dialogue, and then open up the conversation to your comments from the floor. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction and for the opportunity to be here. in New York. I was asked to talk about Jakarta, and I will say some things about a project that I and some colleagues have been doing over the past 5-6 years now, on 3 inner city districts in Jakarta: Senen, Kemayoran, Johor Bahru, an area of about 250,000 people, and very, very mixed up place, full of all kinds of things, all kinds of people, from all kinds of backgrounds, some nice, some not very nice, but something that areas that are very much rambunctious. I've changed the title a little bit to something else besides, and I thought of this title because of something that my daughter Naila said a couple years ago. She said, "Daddy, is it possible to have something else besides pasta for dinner, like nothing?" And from this, from this statement, it's like she's keeping the notion that the integrity of dinner alive. I mean, she's not challenging the notion of dinner, but in some ways subverting what it is by saying like nothing. And so the notion of something else besides is in some sense a kind of force that runs through cities that is not an alternative to what the kind of hegemonic powers of urban development are, but something else besides, something that sort of subverts those kinds of dominant narratives without, in some sense, acting as if there's some kind of major alternative. So that's the kind of sense that runs through the talk tonight. So something else besides cities of shakedowns and skewed deals and money lending and compounding interest and favors and over-invoicing and resale, gambling, extortion, loaded gifts, kickbacks, pay-to-play, and hoarding that so easily now morph into statistical tendencies, branding, big data sets, probabilities, risk profiles, preemptive intervention, analytics as service, interoperable standards, clouds, and ubiquitous position. Something else besides. So imagine the near impossible task of walking the length and width of huge urban regions such as those of Sao Paulo, or Mexico City, or Delhi, or Karachi, or Jakarta. Much of what one would see would not fit easily into the usual images or understanding of built environments and social compositions. Certainly there are large areas of the poor, the rich, and the middle class. But there are also extensive areas where the mixtures are so intense that it's not easy to make any definitive attributions. These are the domains of nurses and teachers, factory and service workers, police, storekeepers, technicians, drivers, and those who adamantly refuse to be officially employed. So many of these heterogeneous domains remain in the historic urban core, as these residents hold on, remake, fend off, and push out in ways that are largely under the radar of the attention of public institutions, research, and investment. So public policy, social movements, and urban politics in general thus miss a critical component of contemporary urban life in these regions. These are districts that have the means to exceed sheer survival. And thus residents have often put to work the little money that is left over after making ends meet to various experiments aimed at improving their lives or opening up new opportunities. In the end, it's not always clear what these thousands of small initiatives actually do. They certainly don't mobilize large amounts of political clout, but perhaps simply keep open the availability of significant portions of the urban core to a wide range of uses and occupations. Again, something else besides. So inhabitants of Jakarta often appear to be passive, disorganized, subjugated, indifferent, yet are part of residential and economic areas that are intensely activated and all over the place, but still work. But we tend to recognize human agency too much as a go-and-get-'em type of thing. Rather, relations between residents here mirror in some way the continuous, often indiscernible intersections and adjustments that take place among various metabolisms, materials, practices, and forms of life. Those relationships that, as Glissant describes in his notion of the right to opacity, always attempt to reach each other, affect each other without a clear agenda or purpose. The turbulent quiet where nevertheless everything gets remade. And I have to thank my other daughter, Zaira, for getting me to read Glissant once again. So, one of the reasons why I think it's important to present this material is based on three propositions. The first of which is that tipping points are imminent in the near future in terms of widespread urban dysfunction. Almost no cities anywhere have their infrastructure and governance stuff right in terms of addressing the challenges of the anthropomorphism. So dysfunction occasioned by the absence of adaptation to ecological crises. But despite this protracted transition period inherent in the development, the need to develop new infrastructure and economies, provides a particular window of opportunity to steer urban politics and redistribution in new directions. Within the next 2 to 3 decades, things have got to be different. Much about cities almost everywhere have to be significantly remade. And at the moment, there's no redistribution projects on the horizon of any significance. So to what extent do you couple the absolute urgency to remake the infrastructure of the city to possibilities to try to get redistribution stuff right in some way? So the ability to reconceptualize and activate new urban political imaginaries and practices capable of engaging this window of opportunity over the next 2 decades is contingent upon intensifying the use of the city as opportunities for learning. And particularly cogent to this argument are the ways in which mixed-use, mixed-income districts in southern cities have been critical arenas for cultivating wide-ranging relational skills. That is, what I will argue in terms of a city like Jakarta is that, and if you look at Indonesia, and if you look at Indonesia, of all the countries in the world, has had the most substantial and rapid elevation of its middle class more than any other country in the world. And this is certainly the case in Jakarta. But this route to middle classness, this way to becoming middle class, wasn't just dependent upon people doing the right thing and being nice and disciplined in their formal job and going to work every day and playing nice and cute. It's also about their capacity to use the relationships between themselves opportunistically as a way to develop new kinds of work, new kinds of employment opportunities. So the dispersal of residents in these districts now to more homogeneously structured peripheries threatens to take apart this resourcefulness. It threatens to dissipate a very critical kind of resource that we might have much to learn from in terms of thinking about how we learn to better face the situation, urban situation we do. And the final proposition is, if the desires for an inclusive urban politics are to be reanimated, this will entail the use of design to refigure existing residential conditions with activities and spaces that enable experimental contacts among inhabitants across the wider city. And design doesn't just entail the construction of new buildings or public spaces, but also conduits of interchange, play, and new kinds of stories. So in some sense, this is also a matter of getting public institutions right and focusing a great deal on what public institutions look like. Too often in cities like Jakarta, public institutions impose, they rationalize, or they withdraw, rather than knowing how to coordinate different districts that essentially govern themselves. But these districts, they can't just leave them to govern themselves. In order to access the kinds of finance, the kinds of infrastructural inputs at scale, there needs to be new kinds of articulations amongst different aspects of the city. And this is particularly challenging in an era where, as what Keller Easterly calls the era of non-statecraft, which marks a particular redistribution of responsibilities and obligations in which claims for political rights and recognition are relayed through a complex web of provisional relief mechanisms, rebranding exercises, private public investment schemes, or development spectacles that simply dismiss a large range of collective efforts on the part of local districts to work their way toward each other, to establish complementary practices of making and exchanging things and experiences. And in this period of non-statecraft, more and more of the connective tissue is then lost amongst different aspects of the urban landscape. So just some images from the areas in which I'm talking about. So we're talking about districts where people of different backgrounds, class statuses, ethnic and geographical origins, and occupations operate in close proximity to each other. And where this proximity means different things. Sometimes it means closeness, sometimes distance. Sometimes it means collaboration, and sometimes separation. But it's this very oscillation that is important. There's no underlying commonality. Things don't fit easily. But the sheer diversity of ways of doing things offer individuals the concrete potential to alter their course of action. Not everything has to be accommodated or brought into consensus. This is not an easy cosmopolitanism. There are antagonisms, tipping points, jealousies, and plenty of misunderstandings. Yet over time, they have not deterred the capacity of residents to develop multiple and varying practices of how they use their districts and connect them to the wider city. So, just pluridistricts is just a kind of placeholder of what to call these things. Placeholders did not just house people or business. They continuously suggested different interrelationships among bodies, things, infrastructure, material space, and language. People knew that they could not sit still. Security meant being able to keep a pace with all the changes happening around them. Circulation was the key. And circulation meant the intermeshing of different life forms and materials that generate circuits of association, that connect individuals and households transversally across defined territories and sectors. So Sobranto, a 60-year-old mechanic, puts it, sometimes it was important just to do something, anything, no matter if you had anything specific in mind. It was a way of seeing what else could happen in one's life without risking too much. And Rita, a 40-year-old local counselor, puts it, life wasn't easy for anyone, but neither was it full of hardships, just somewhere in between. Families had to make sure they had what they needed, but usually had a little something extra that they wanted to make grow for them. As a lot of things were going on in the neighborhood, people doing different things, coming and going, there was so much for people to pay attention to, and so we had to figure out ways of getting people's attention without drawing too much attention to ourselves. Rona, a 47-year-old property broker, pointed out, see, no one here could quite go it alone. You didn't necessarily help out your neighbor directly, but you knew that if they had more breathing space to work with, more opportunities to make their lives better, then the overall situation for you would also improve. You wouldn't have to worry about their making problems for you or taking chances that would have a negative effect on your situation. Our idea was not so much to keep the city out of our neighborhoods, but to make them part of the larger city. So in some sense, much of Jakarta, much of the responsibility for building Jakarta was that of residents themselves. But households didn't just build their own homes. Affordability, the ability to afford to live in the urban core meant density. But not just the density of bodies, but the densification of techniques. That is, the intermixing of measures and angles and calculations, impulses, screens, surfaces, soundscapes, exposures, folds, circuitries, and layers. All of them as instruments for associating things, bringing things into association, where things get their bearings by having a bearing on each other. So when we talk about density, it's not just about the density of bodies, it's the density of ways of doing things. It's the density of the different kinds of devices that can be applied in terms of the materials that people have access to. So in some sense, the density of devices with the materials that people have access to. So density of methods of construction produced districts that were full of stuff. Now, not all of this stuff connects. This stuff has to be coaxed and steered into relations. When materials and ways of doing things, institutional agendas, and characteristics of actors do not fit, operational frictions are generated, and these frictions can be productive. So it wasn't a matter of just trying to attain consensus or trying to design things with some kind of seamless harmony. Quite the opposite. It was in some sense producing things that didn't fit together at all, because things not fitting produced a sense of tension. And this kind of tension provided people with opportunities to continue to work on stuff. It made people who otherwise may not have felt useful in a particular area to feel useful because of the tension they could be drawn upon with their resources, their experience, and particular backgrounds. So in the built environment, there was a mixture of all kinds of things, all kinds of materials. Sometimes these materials were bought. Sometimes they were scavenged. Sometimes they were recycled. Sometimes they were hybridized. Even in terms of the land and the plots, sometimes they were divided. Sometimes they were consolidated. Sometimes changes were incremental. Sometimes there were sweeping and broad renovations. In the local economy, there was the move toward intensive specialization and upscaling of economic activities in terms of multidimensional production. At the same time, there was also the proliferation of small, diversified businesses owned by related family and social networks, and also the aggrandizement of economic activities under the corporate ownership of previously unrelated entrepreneurs. All of these different logics of making things often operated side by side with each other, not one ruling out the other, not one necessarily dominating and making the other irrelevant. Now we know in our urban environment that our urban environment is loaded with sensors of all kinds. It's loaded with information collecting techniques in order to establish parameters of all kinds, to be able to establish normal parameters of functioning. What is functional and what is not, what is dangerous or what is not, what is risky or what is not. So the movement of people and energy and water and traffic and services and goods and information through the city is increasingly shaped and regulated by parametric design. That is, all these sensors, all these tracking systems establish particular designs of functioning. But what happens is that this brings together different data sets related to these things. And it modulates the variable relationships among them and alters their properties as a result. So now we can make water and energy and sanitation and financing and transport and municipal finance and economic development all seemingly impact upon each other through recursive feedback loops. But because of this, in our attempts to better control and establish, okay, what is the relationship between transportation and material water flows through the urban environment? And what's the relationship between that and particular forms of urban finance generation, how you raise revenue? And what's the relationship between that and other demographic factors? So increasingly we move toward a kind of form of algorithmic governance, where we think that we can exercise more precise control by bringing these different kinds of sectors in function into some kind of relationship to each other. But the more that we bring them into some kind of relationship to each other, the more new, unpredictable, unfixable realities are produced in the very act of trying to better control things. Well, this is something that many residents of pluridistricts have known all along. that by taking materials out of their usual context and uses and meanings, and then piecing them together, they themselves could produce unforeseen and not readily controllable outcomes. Specific ways of existing, thinking, seeing, claiming, affecting, informing, and making that do not belong to specific actors or modes of organizing. I mean, you have to understand, like in a place like Jakarta, under 30 years of the most banal kind of military corporate rule, where Suharto basically was afraid of the city, was afraid of these districts, and tried everything to do to introduce different kinds of surveillance mechanisms into that. Residents had to be in the position to make themselves look as if they're easily understood, so that everyone who goes to these districts say, oh yeah, we know what's going on. We know who you are, we know what you're doing, we know what you're doing. But to create the impression of being knowable, but at the same time being able to subvert that, to be something else besides. This game of allowing others to think, oh, we've got the game, we know what's going on. But at the same time doing something that's unforeseen, not readily then controlled. It's a politics that goes beyond specific claims and interests and agendas. And what they came up with was not always what they wanted or could conceive of. What they came up with was not always or even often fair and just. But it was a position from which they could move with the volatilities of the city and to which they also brought about. So they're also in a situation where the way they're playing this, the way they're trying to create a life in the city, is in relationship to the volatility of the city, but their very way of dealing with it intensifies the very volatility that they themselves continuously have to adjust to. So in the districts that we work in Jakarta, it's nearly impossible in many areas to recognize a standard form of residence. Lane after lane is replete with mixtures of different materials, designs, formats, and construction values that have been deployed to make homes, workshops, businesses, offices, mosques, churches, and storage places. There are often highly divergent trajectories of development. Some plots have retained their original structure over decades, haven't changed at all, while those right next door have witnessed multiple buildings come and go. Well laid out grids marking standard plot size may be preserved without alteration. But then in the neighborhood right next door, it is possible to find frontage bordering the marked streets that mirror these grids, but behind which have been completely taken on a life of its own, started by a few random subdivisions of back lots that then have been extended laterally in all different kinds of directions, and often housing a class of residents markedly poorer than those who continue to live in front. So how do residents know that there are many different ways to get something done when the way you are familiar with or prefer just isn't possible now? And it's largely simply because the way these places look, full of different ins and outs and different kinds of stuff in different places where you can put your body. All of this reminds them of these possibilities every day. And this plenitude is the product of the proliferation of technical operations. That is the bringing into relationship of different materials and devices. For example, residents play with the textures of the surface. They connect wires and cables across different sites and kinds of ownership and use. They fill in vacancies and recesses with provisional structures and activities. They skip over interruptions and blockages in cul-de-sacs to expand various projects. While the fabric can look chaotic, ill-managed, and often on the verge of collapse and overuse, and indeed often is, there is also an incessant recalibrations and adjustments and repair. In order to make discrepant uses and environments work together, there needs to be various negotiations and deals from which it is difficult to exclude inhabitants simply based on their background or identity. These things too must be put into play. In other words, they become potential resources for the continuous process of working things out, of managing the tensions and overloads. Like, I mean, in districts, everybody knows who everyone is. If you're Batak, it's likely you're going to drive a bus. If you're from Madura, it's likely that you're going to steal hardware. If you're from Padang, it's likely that you're going to make textile. I mean, it's no secret who people are. And people affiliate. They affiliate with, in some sense, common identities. But they also say time and time again, it's important for us to have these moments of belonging, but we can't stay there, because if we stay there, we don't learn nothing. I'm either too obligated. If I treat everyone as my sister or my brother, and part of a common ethnicity, then I owe you, and you owe me. And much of the time we spend with each other is just simply counting our obligations. And living in a city like this, we don't got time for that kind of stuff. In some sense, we have to keep moving. So the very notion of people's common identities is also put into play. It's also something that is put into the mix. So the sheer diversity so while this heterogeneity is partly a function of different stories of opportunism, accumulation, and loss, I mean, again, what people do don't always work. People lose, and sometimes they lose a lot. Sometimes people gain, and they gain a lot, and then they lose it. I mean, there's always these stories of accumulation and loss. Now you have it, now you don't, now you put something away, you risk it, you lose it, you try it again. So in some sense, people negotiate mutual accommodations over how to acquire and develop land. They oftentimes manipulate people's vulnerabilities and availing space and opportunities as devices to supplemental income. It's not always a pretty picture. But the sheer diversity of the built environment and the activities that took place within it and in close proximity to each other always would seem to generate some kind of talk, some kind of discussion, some kind of compensation, some kind of repair, alliances and trade-offs and short-term pooling of information and contacts and resources, all of which supplemented official income and earnings. For the majority, it was important to construct built environments that made possible opportunities for people to look at each other, to watch each other, as a form of continuous change of the narratives of what it means to have a good livelihood. In other words, opportunities for residents to pay attention to each other were not created in order to ensure that their behaviors conformed to the prevailing standards of propriety. Rather, this witnessing was the very condition to continuously remake what those standards look like, and as a means to redraw the lines of social collaboration. That is, folding residents into new kinds of collective action that need not be stabilized in particular forms over time. I mean, we did about 400 households, just for the hell of it, we just did like 400 household surveys. I mean, just to see what like people's social networks look like. Just to get people to tell us, okay, who's in your life? Who do you talk to? You know, who do you spend your time with? And it was really interesting to see that, okay, yeah, people spend a lot of time with people who are like them. Okay, they go to mosque together, there's their families, but it was also interesting to see the number of people in household lives that were really short-term contacts. People that they didn't know for very long, and they didn't expect to know for very long. That they had no aspiration to make long-term friendships with, not long-term connections with, because their idea is that in some sense we need people in our life that help take us places that we don't know. So in some sense it was part of this sense of just to try to keep on moving. So residents always had to initiate some kind of activity to create or supplement their incomes. And since most people knew that whatever they did would operate in a crowded field of others, they had to adapt, adjust, negotiate, and come up with projects that incorporated the ideas, income, and labors of others. That is, if everyone knew that their income was not enough, if everyone knew that their official place in life was not sufficient to do what they wanted to, then they knew they had to do something else. So they came up with ideas, but you also knew just because I have this idea, this plan, don't mean I can go A to B direct. Because I also know that all of you are doing the same thing. and that we're operating in a very crowded field of everyone trying to do something extra. So the only way in which it works is if I pay attention to what you're doing and you pay attention to what I'm doing, and sometimes sometimes it ain't gonna work, and sometimes we try to make adjustments in relationship to each other. But you had to assume that you weren't the only person in town doing what you were attempting to do. So collaborations were usually temporary, as projects and people would come and go. And so residents would not rely upon one way of doing things, but knew that they would have to spread out, become equipped at working different versions of themselves and their values. Artie, a local counselor from one of the areas in which we work, says, if everybody sees themselves starting from the same starting point, that is being fundamentally linked and identified with each other, then we're going to have to look over our shoulder the whole time. We'll have little opportunity to make mistakes and to be free to do things differently than everyone else expects us to do. See, if you look around here, it looks pretty messy and disorganized. People feel the need to always do something. Most of the time, it doesn't really matter to them what it is, because the important thing is for you to show others that you are willing to do something different. So people do what they can with what they can afford, where they have connections to get hold of the materials they need, and a lot of times the results are not very pretty and don't work. So there are problems. But because no matter how their efforts have worked or not, they have already let others know that they are willing to do things. So the idea here is like the exigency to do something, to communicate to those around you that yes, you're willing to play, you're willing to move from the position that people know you as and do something else. So in some sense, what I'm trying to get at here is that the complexity of this built environment. That is, there are times when the built environment speaks in lieu of its inhabitants, where the built environment is a political instrument. And in some ways, this is the claim I want to make in Jakarta. The built environment itself is doing a kind of politics. It speaks in lieu of its inhabitants because it conveys a capacity of assembled action of which the residents are a part, but where they don't, but where they are not always directly aware of such a capacity, where there's no forms of conveyance or representation or consciousness that would identify the residents as the purveyors of a kind of conscious strategy. That is, in some ways, the built environment itself acts politically in these situations. It is a kind of assemblage of politics. And this just to say that the way in which these increments go in different directions, the way in which different adjustments become opportunities and constraints for each other, the way that actors themselves change their mind and set off in new directions, especially as directions themselves are suggested by changes in the surrounds themselves, and especially since certain opportunities are time limited, as the environment continues to change all of the time. So, in some sense, viable, if often limited livelihoods derive largely from a multiplicity of incremental maneuvers undertaken to build upon and extend whatever a household had access to. These maneuvers often relied upon positioning whatever assets the family had, financial, social, and psychological, within new neighborhoods of association. As such, households would speculate on the very conditions that made them a social unit. In other words, speculative activities put into play the very conditions through which these households recognize themselves as a life shared together, as a sense of predictable bonds, shared assets, and common collective performances. That is, you have this kind of dynamic where, yes, it's important for us to think of ourselves as a kind of collective unit, as people who depend upon each other, people tied together by family ties that are going to last for long periods of time. But it's interesting the way in which those very conditions, those very things that made the households a kind of cohesive unit, were themselves risked. where households themselves actively sought opportunities to do things that perhaps threaten the very sense by which they recognize themselves as a kind of collective unit. Because the new initiatives that they did often operated against the grain of what households were accustomed to doing. They would have to signal their willingness to participate in schemes and with actors that they otherwise might have shied away from. They would demonstrate their willingness to perform roles with others that might be discordant with the way they perform their relationships with each other. Instead of the wider neighborhood being an extension, somehow an extension of the household ethos, that larger neighborhood was actively cultivated as a divergent arena of interest and operations, even when ties of belonging through ethnicity and commonplace or origin or religious practice were maintained. So it wasn't sort of an either-or situation. It was a both-and situation. Households knew that they operated in a crowded field, and that the best laid plans would probably require continuous revisions and adaptations to those of others in order to accomplish anything. And as always, substantial risks were involved. And very often these risks were enormous. And very often households failed. It was not the kind of safe game. And there are many stories of failure. But the sense that people risked failure because in some sense there was also failure all around. And because in some way, these neighborhoods were so all over the place. I mean, what could you do to mess it up? They're already so messed up that what could yourself, with your small initiatives, really do to mess it up any more than already messed up? So it gave people the sense of a kind of courage, a kind of audacity, a kind of sense of, well, this place can absorb things. This place can absorb me and what I try to do. And it may not work, and it may be really messed up, but I'm not going to, in some sense, undermine everything. So in some sense, we're now at a kind of tipping point. That is, in some sense, Jakarta is a city with the fastest growing real estate values in the world. Right? I mean, if anyone wants to make any investments, I'm glad to talk to you afterwards, and I'm sure we could work out some kind of deals. But there is this kind of proliferation of the notion of the all-in-one, the fantasy of the all-in-one. And what does the all-in-one do? Does the all-in-one being sort of residential complexes where everything is there? All right? You've got your shopping mall, you've got your apartment, you've got your school, you've got your daycare, you've got your clinics, you've got your entertainment, you've got probably everything you need except to go to the airport or maybe to go to work. But otherwise, you're there. And what the all-in-one does is in some sense say, you don't need all these, what your relationship should be is with the larger world. It's you as an individual, and you should work on your own sense of efficacy, your own sense of being able to deal with the larger world. Like, don't bother with these labor-intensive stuff in these districts. You don't need these relationships anymore. Your relationship is, and we provide you the kind of infrastructure which you don't have to worry. You never have to touch the street. You never have to deal with this kind of mess ever again. And these kinds of situations indeed are growing in places like Jakarta. But in some sense, I think that in a way that it is a kind of recontainment, it's a kind of political recontainment of the ability of urban actors to do something about the city through a kind of de-skilling. Because I think that there's a kind of active de-skilling, a de-skilling in terms of proficiencies of how you can relate to different kinds of materials, different kinds of situations, different kinds of work that has long been the legacy, long been the kind of ticket to viability in these neighborhoods. And so then, let me just end with a quote from a collaborator of mine who considers himself my senior since he's one day older than I am. And let me just end with him. Around here, something is always going wrong. We all think we can fix things, and sometimes we can't. But sometimes we get ourselves into more trouble, so people have to step in. Still, you have to show that you are not afraid of letting things be what they are. This place is never going to be the promised land. It's been comfortable to us because we didn't have to break our backs trying to keep things going. Look at this street. Look at how many new things are being built up. But none of them are like high society type things. People are doing things that are just enough for them now. They can do them because this is not a place where things are now set in stone. All of these people, they made their connections. They put their money together. And they can do things. Even I know for a fact that they don't have certificates and formal permission. You see, there's a lot of things going on in a place like this. It might not seem that way, but there are a lot of different interests and goals, so it'd never be easy, even when the big money people bring in suitcases full of cash. We are out there in the world. We take our ideas about it and bring them here, which means that we are also really out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I've just got a couple of sort of reflections on Maliq's talk, and I have to sort of preface these couple of provocations with just sort of how delighted I am to be here. I've been incredibly influenced by AbdouMaliq Simone's work throughout my own career, and it's just really a fantastic opportunity for me to be able to sit here next to him and talk to him about his new work. So I'm really delighted. Thank you so much, Hillary, for the invitation. As usual, Maliq has offered a wealth of generative insights for how to understand cities, how to understand the sort of material infrastructure that is a city, that is cities in the global south. But more importantly, about how to really think about and understand the lives of these cities' subjects, right? So how to think about the life worlds of the average quiet majority as they navigate the material and social dimensions of city life. I know Maliq's work on African cities better than I do his work on Asian cities, so that's probably been the bulk of your career in any case. But I see here, much like his work on African urbanism, you know, that he's offering a great deal in terms of thinking about the lives of people in these cities. That he's offering a great deal about thinking about the literal aspirations, the lines of sight, the traces, the movements of people living in cities in the global south. As they forge relations, as they search out opportunities, as they reproduce life in the city, as they survive in many respects, and do more than survive. So I see this probably because it was the first piece that I ever read of Maliq's work, but as a sort of extension of his work, thinking about people as infrastructure, and I'm referring to, a lot of my students are in here and I've assigned this to them, so I'm sort of referring back to the first piece that we started our class on colonial urbanism with. But I'm referring to this notion that Maliq has really developed over the course of at least a decade, of thinking about how everyday urban residents operate in the face of, alongside, and in opposition to the various crafts and judgments of those supposedly building, designing, or controlling the city and its patterns or its futures. And so in this way, I think his work has been incredibly influential in shaping the way that we consider action, agency, practice in the city, the social psychology, literally, of the urban resident in his way of illuminating, exploring what I like to think of as sort of the bricolage of urban life in sort of ordinary cities. The bricolage through which urban residents perceive, understand, and inhabit their cities. So his work is really crucial towards formulating an alternative vision for understanding the energies to be built upon, the energies to be seized, unleashed in cities of the global south, or to follow Jenny Robinson's work in ordinary cities, not world cities, global cities necessarily. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it helps to resist the sort of long tradition of sort of discursive othering within urbanist scholarship and especially developmentalist visions, which I think have consistently and sort of hegemonically described processes in southern cities through profoundly uncreative, stumbling languages of lack, informality, or at its worst, chaos. This is how the African city certainly gets described, and I think other ordinary cities like Jakarta. And so Maliq's approach is obviously one that counters that in very profound ways. We're thinking about sort of deconstructing, decolonizing urban theory through talking about what is constructive in these cities, right? Through talking about what is constructive in the ordinary. Through talking about the modes of auto-construction that are the literal city-building processes in places like Jakarta. The density of methods of construction beyond urban design and planning. So this is a very different way of talking about the city than talking about informality. Again, another uncreative in my mind way of talking about what is going on here. The informal, if we are to sort of think of it in those terms, in Maliq's rendering, is intensely productive, right? It has something very different to do with the formal than just posing it as the opposite of. It's crafty, it's innovative, it's ingenious in many respects. And as a result, you can see how these processes are, in fact, the platform for much wider processes, much wider opportunities and possibilities of what the city can be. So this is an incredibly constructive vision in certain respects of what processes of city making, planning, development must not just reckon with, but incorporate into their ordering visions, right? These are clearly the building blocks of the city yet to come, and referencing his book on 4 African cities. We can see here all that may be lost by the modernist urban plans that aim to clean, order, regulate urban space and the people who live there, because they will elide all of the sort of insight and ingenuity that he's just come to describe for us. But it also does pose some challenges, this way of thinking about the city. And so I do have sort of 3 questions or 3 provocations, and you can take them or leave them, or you can incorporate them into your response to the next sort of section of the program. And the first is sort of in building on what I know the program, that this talk is just one event of, is thinking about, urban planning, thinking about the challenge of urban development and the challenge posed to planners. So this is just a very practical question of sort of what does a vision of urban planning that actually reckons with these processes actually look like on a practical level? How can one design urban plans and processes and architecture of the future city if you are actually in a position of power to forward something like a design or a plan? How are you responsive, even generative, of processes like this? How do you respond to the social infrastructures in a way that doesn't silence them, but encourages them? How do you respond to this notion of the built assemblage as sort of an assemblage, the built environment as an assemblage in a practical sense, as a sort of planner? But on the other side, I also want to pose some sort of questions and challenges for how we think about what shapes and limits the possibilities of efficacious action, as we can think of it through these terms. And I know he's done a lot of thinking about this, so I'd love to hear more about it. And the first, sort of 2 questions here, and the first really has to do with place. I'm a geographer, so I like to talk about place and space. I have that in most interventions, so here I am. But no, what I'm really interested in is sort of fleshing out how the historically sedimented infrastructures, the canals, the cables, the pavements, that do structure these possibilities in particular settings actually work. So I'm interested in how we understand the role of people's so-called baggage, or the memories and the identities and the claims to belonging, as they root in the soil of the city, interface with and structure these forms of collaboration, these dynamic forms of social networking, social connection that he has just come to describe. And you just presented about Jakarta, so I'm really curious about how you see those types of forces. You gave a little bit about the history here, how they congeal in sort of particular places. You've described social relations as a glue before, and I wonder how you see the relationship between social relations as glue and place in this particular place that you're talking about. In other words, what is the relationship between belonging and people's spatial practices? Or how does place in its particular history matter for the patterns and efficacies of social relations? In the face of the, what you were talking about at the end, the sort of spectacular closures of urban space, or the sort of turn towards an eclipsing or even a erasing of these forms of urbanism, these pluridistricts, because I believe there's a sort of trajectory that you're charting that is moving away from this, right? In the face of that eclipsing, or in the face of sort of spectacular modernist planning schemes in the name of producing no longer messy cities, or the all-in-one city, I wonder how we understand the intersection of these sort of vernacular city-building processes with those efforts to produce a different kind of space, a clean space, an orderly space, an upgraded space, if we're talking about slum upgrading, or otherwise sort of improved urban plans. And related to this is, this is just sort of, a question out of my own curiosity. I wonder if you might share with us a little bit about what it's been like to move to thinking about this particular place, that of Jakarta, after working for so long in African cities. Is that relevant? Is it crucial to this story or not? What is the power of those spatial categories? Do they mean anything? Do they mean a lot? For thinking about this sort of relationship between space and the possibility of efficacious action. My second question then just has to do with politics. You gesture to the political possibilities of these relations and practices, and I'm interested in some elaboration here. And in particular, I'm interested in your thoughts on the sort of burdens of this way of practicing, owning, inhabiting the city. So what are the limits of the need to constantly sort of resituate yourself in order to keep the doors open, the hinge that you've spoken about before of always sort of being, trying to keep the city legible and visible to you so that you can react and respond and provide for future efficacious action. So what are the limits of that project, of that burden, of the need to constantly sort of resituate oneself in order to avoid the increasing precarity of many of these cities, or the various sort of impossibilities of becoming that we see, especially over the last couple of decades in many of the cities that I know you've worked within. I just read Alcinda Hanwana's book about youth in African cities, and I guess I'm wondering when mobility, this sort of incessant mobility and striving, butts up against what she has termed the condition of waithood, or the condition of youth stuck in a time when they no longer have the privilege of aspiring to become something else. Or maybe I'm just drawing from a different context that is not necessarily relevant here, but I imagine that it might be. So when does mobility and striving sort of butt up against that waiting, that incessant stuckness that so many people, particularly youth, are finding themselves in more and more? Does it not erode the foundations of solidarity to be incessantly prepared, ready to convert, to switch allegiances, to move on to the next thing? And I guess I'm just interested in talk more about your thoughts on what that means for efficacious political action, the meaning of these particular relations that you characterized. And I look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for those quite incisive comments. Where to start? I mean, let me work backward, and let me take on the issue of political mobilization. I mean, in some way, and in part it reflects our failures in this project as well. I mean, for example, in some of these areas produce up to 20% of the clothing worn by Indonesians in hundreds of different small-scale artisanal textile production, fabrication workshops of different sizes, with different labor markets, with different ways of doing things, with different ways of remuneration, of all different kinds of logics to make things. And it's not very clear sometimes who's behind it. I mean, it's not that people are unaware that of what the prices of cotton are. It's not that people are unaware of the fluctuation in customs duties at the port. It's not that people are unaware of the kind of capital investment that they don't have, that operates behind the scenes, that in some sense infuses itself in this kind of operation. But nevertheless, someone comes along, young guy, 39 years old, and he becomes the head of this district. They call it Kecamatan. So he now wants to do something. He says, okay, we got this resource. This is the economy of my district, and I want to do something. And I want to like organize a kind of upfront association of all these fabricators. And I want to know what the kinds of articulations are. I want to be able for everyone to sort of set the rules. I want to upscale this. I want to maximize the efficiency of all that gets done. And I want them to then be able to leverage some real money to make sure that these areas are not flooded during key moments of the year, when trucks can't come and go very easily to take the stuff to the market, or take things from one workshop to another for it to be finished. And I want to make sure that in some ways that we become known up front as this kind of, because this is the way we also leverage some kind of municipal power. Only we make what we do more visible. If we put this on the map, then we become significant players in this region. So help us do this. Help us figure it out. And let's proceed to make this kind of local economic development district based on textile production, and let's organize it. Well, it was dead in the water basically, because no one basically wanted to do it. And even though the different fabricators would all have different complaints about what everyone else was doing, and they would complain about the kind of lack of transparency. They complain about some big people maneuvering behind the scenes. Or they had aspirations to do something very differently. They said, yeah, this is great. We think that this idea is worth working on. But as soon as you move to try to do it, then there's this kind of reluctance. Because too often the kind of logic behind these modes of organization expect people to be well behaved. And so there's a kind of and that dependence on good behavior sometimes isn't what people think works in terms of making that sector as inclusive as possible. That is, what counts for people is how can we include as many different people who are living here as part of the game. And it may mean that they're not paid so well. It may mean that they're working under some fairly bad and onerous conditions. It may mean that in the end, we don't get the kind of larger profit that is possible from what this could produce. But there's a kind of concern that these kinds of mechanisms, these kinds of imaginaries of doing politics, in some ways close down the notion of inclusiveness. Inclusive based on a kind of oscillation of being able to, when you have too much, when you have excessive kind of workloads being distributed out, subcontracted to other people off the books, without the big boss knowing about it. So in some sense, what we're learning from this is how do you work within the kind of rhythms and oftentimes the bad behavior, the proliferations of all different ways of doing things, in order to try to, in some sense, assemble these kinds of activities as a kind of municipal force. I mean, we're trying to also work in one of Southeast Asia's largest, in fact it is Southeast Asia's largest textile market, with 10,000 stalls. That's 10,000 people that are, and it's officially owned by the municipality. The municipality subcontracts the running of this market to the city's largest private developer, the Podomoro Group. And this market is they build huge, big mega complexes, but this market is their largest earner per year. It earns them $1 billion a year. But they don't run the thing. They subcontract it out to a holding company. The holding company subcontracts it out to an informal association of very nefarious characters who basically understand what it is that the hawkers do, the people who push the thing, the drivers, the parkers, the people, the big Indo-Chinese money people, the kind of sellers who are paying big money for that stall every year, all of the different kinds of buying groups that come from all over Indonesia to buy, trying to work in that situation where the real control over that significant economic activity basically is run by a kind of impromptu but very disciplined assemblage of forces that it's not very clear exactly who is always in charge, and like when someone says, take me to your leader, there's someone in the market that exists just for that, just to be the leader that is taken to. He don't have no other power than simply to be the recipient of visitors who are always saying, take me to the leader. So in some sense, there's this kind of diffusion of authority and responsibility under different kinds of performances, different kinds of ways of doing things. But they have to pay attention to each other. They have to find some kind of way of dealing with each other. So how do you, in that kind of context, think about using the market as a way in which to do politics? How do you simply, in some ways, use the opportunity of all those thousands and thousands of people gathered there every day to simply hand out information about HIV/AIDS, information about where there is, what kinds of loans are available to do local upgrades in terms of sanitation. How do you, what kinds of municipal agencies to go to register particular kinds of complaints, when in some sense the municipality doesn't even have the mechanisms to distribute this kind of information. So the challenge in some way is, in some sense, how you work through these already constituted bodies of significant force. I mean, the whole history of sort of decentralized governance and participation has been predicated on sitting nice and cute in some kind of meeting and participating and approving plans, but it doesn't, in some sense, capture what the real participation is day after day. The challenge is how can we intervene in these kinds of situations to steer them in a more productive way. I mean, and a lot of this politics too has to do with this moment of a kind of pervasive anxiety. There is a pervasive anxiety amongst people who now have money in their pockets and they think, all right, I should buy a car. I like to have a car. I want to go shop at a shopping mall. Oh, it's nice and air conditioned, it's good. I won't buy anything there, but I still like to go. And these shopping malls increasingly only allow you to enter if you have a car. So car plus shopping mall plus I'm not buying anything there, but there's this expectation that now that we are barely middle class, you just cross that threshold. I mean, cross that threshold in this whatever weird way in which multilaterals define the threshold to become going into middle class. But it is a pervasive anxiety that in some sense, yes, it's a lot of work dealing with all these messy kinds of relationships that we're dealing with. What we're promised now is a kind of nice apartment that we can buy cheaply, and maybe this is what we should do. In fact, this is the kind of expectation of what we should do. After all, we're now middle class. We're beginning to save something, but then there's the worry. Well, how did I get to be there? I didn't get to be there simply, as I said before, simply being well disciplined at work. There's a kind of anxiety that this is what we now have to do. So then you begin to see the relationships changing, and when I meet a lot of times with different kinds of groups, there is a kind of obsession about the price. That is, how much should we hold out for? And instead of paying attention to what are we with each other, what have we accomplished, what have we done, look at what we've built. There is this kind of now, what's the price? What should we hold out? There's always a sense of a conceding. But a worry that they also know that then we, in some sense, put ourselves in a situation in which we lose the very kinds of mechanisms that got us there to begin. So, in some sense, there has to be some kind of there has to be, in some sense, an intervention in the notion of how you rebuild, how you. I mean, it's really interesting that we're now talking with people who are the service workers at these new mega developments. The ones who are the janitors, the ones who fix the elevators, the ones who drive the truck. And it's very interesting, in some way they talk about, they say, we're really overworked here. So why are you overworked? Because we're constantly getting calls. Constantly getting calls about what? Well, we really don't want to talk about it too much, but the people who are moving into this place, they're a little bit strange. Why are they a little bit strange? Because they see things in the middle of the night. They see things like lights all of a sudden disappear in the whole building, or the air conditioning all goes off, or there are unexplained occurrences where water in the bathtub won't stop running. So even within the mega developments, even within these new, there is a kind, when people bring in that anxiety is a kind of popular culture of a worry that in some sense they're now placed in situations that somehow are basically not good for them. But also, you have to understand too, also the real estate mechanics of these new mega developments as well, because in some way the trick is you have to sell, you build and you sell them. So oftentimes they're sold before they're even built, so they have to be turned over, and a lot of times it's in terms of speculation. So the initial buyer will, in some sense, try to get rid of them, and they get rid of them, and then they don't care who lives there. So then what's become interesting is to look at who's actually now living in these new neighborhoods. And it's not your oftentimes you're the kind of elite. Sometimes it's like 10 people who work for an airline who are living together, and you count the number of shoes by the front door in the hallway. So in some ways, it also means how you then also relate to these new constructions. You know, that is, do you become wedded to a particular kind of form, which I've been talking about? Or are there ways in which this can be translated into the kind of new, the generation of the new built environment which is taking place? And then the notion about taking place. Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, the very interesting thing about the way in which where stuff is located is described is not in terms really of, I mean, if you ask people, how did the place get to be this way? How did this place get to look the way it is? And people have their stories, but they're always, in a sense, somehow disagreeing with each other about a kind of clear narrative about who owns this, or who sold this, or, I mean, and there's a kind of reluctance to, there is a kind of shying away from and that notion of trying to put into place a sense of criteria about who owns things. Because there's a lot of property in Jakarta that is tied up in terms of property disputes. There's not a mechanism where people really, in some sense, pass on their property officially to their kids. Because in some sense, there's this sense of not tying things down too much, not constituting a kind of definitive story about the place. Now that there's a problem with that too, because it makes it very difficult sometimes to renovate the kind of infrastructure, the canals, the sewage, the wiring, and especially now because in central city Jakarta, everyone rents part of what they have to outside. If you're poor, if you're rich, you turn part of your living space into rental space. So neighborhoods are becoming, I mean, what's interesting, the official demographics say, yes, this neighborhood is officially losing this amount of population. But unofficially, it's just the opposite. There's a whole new generation of people, young people coming in, renting rooms because it's close to work. But it also means that you have pouring into these areas a lot of strangers. And that pouring in may themselves constitute tipping points on long-home relationships between people. So the very things that they try to generate the kind of income necessary to increase the kind of value of what they have often means that they sometimes can be shooting themselves in the foot at the same time. So it's very interesting. I mean, Jakarta is a very lewd place. And the talk about place is extremely sexualized. That is the talk about where things are. You know, it's like I'm sitting there with a local authority guy. He points across the street at a public phone booth, and the public phone booth is set right in terms of where that family does their laundry. So in some sense, the guy is saying, every time someone wants to make a call, they have to go inspect the family's underwear. There's always this sense of a kind of popular, anti-elitist, bad talk, kind of nasty way of talking about where things are. That is, we always talk about like, a typical greeting is when someone comes out of a person's house saying, I'm glad you were in the right bedroom last night. Because in some ways, this sense of emplacement with these kinds of sexual metaphors, in some sense, says that, okay, it's not clear exactly what belongs to who, and the only way that we're going to grasp them is in a kind of interrelational kind of way. I haven't addressed a lot of things that you asked, but
Maybe
yeah,
we should
I think, yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk, and Professor Fredericks, thanks for your comments. And trying to think about this relationship that you're suggesting for us, where in the built form seems to really conditioned sociality and what's possible socially. And I'm thinking especially about this something else besides, especially if what we're talking about is agentive sociality, something that exists in any context of uneven power relations, not just something that exists in a certain kind of built form. So I'm trying to bridge these two pieces of when and how and why the kinds of sociality that you're describing, this agentive sociality, are cut off, and when and how and why they're not, and whether we can predict that based on the built form itself, right? I mean, are some of those ties also creatively forged and improvised among people who either newly inhabit or have inhabited for a long time what at first blush looks like a much more formalized built environment? Or is it that, as part of your argument that those things are rendered impossible by certain kinds of, in this case, modernist built forms?
I mean, there can be very different trajectories, and trying to understand what those trajectories are is oftentimes very difficult, because you can have contiguous districts which the state basically laid out the basic infrastructure at the same time, constructed simple basic pavilions on very good gridded streets. The composition of the residents who accessed those houses were very much the same. But you have very different trajectories that sometimes have taken place. Because you have some areas in which those pavilions, those original pavilions, still basically stand without a great deal of renovation, without a great deal of change. And you have others that are, in some sense, right next to them, of which there have been massive changes over the last 40 years. So trying to understand where those kinds of divergent trajectories, what in some sense accounts for them. And I think part of what accounts for them is, in some sense, a lot of the things that I've been talking about. That is that frictions can be very, very productive, because they engender particular kinds of adjustments and recalibrations and particular kinds of deals, and ways in which, for example, like oftentimes land is brokered with each other, borrowed, lent, when particular households don't have access to it, when they have particular kind of financial problems, and that household is rehoused by the district somewhere else. There is a kind of continuous, and now particularly there's a kind of continuous attempt to try to do something differently with the building stock that is there. And so there's a way in which, for example, a kind of new practice has been, how are we able to stay in place? So people will come to say, for example, you have a two-story pavilion, and a group of residents will try to approach a kind of local developer, and what they will say is, okay, you sell us the plot. We build like a 10-story building. We give you the first story, and we give you 20% of the profits that are accumulated in the rest of the building. So, in some sense, you have those kinds of adjustments as well, and oftentimes they are precipitated by neighborhoods that have already experienced a great deal of recalibration, whereas in other neighborhoods that haven't, they have a sense that, oh my God, the developers are coming, the only thing I can do is sell and move to the periphery. So there are particular kinds of histories at work in terms of particular ways in which residents have already experimented with these kinds of readjustments that in some sense give some kind of, not security in the long run, but security in the interim.
Yeah, thank you. I have two questions that might be linked, but I'm not yet sure. The first has to do with the idea of the right to opacity. and to ask you to speak a little bit more on that. And the second has to do with the first proposition of redistribution. So on the question, what I'm interested in the opacity point is really the conditions under which opacity matters and the conditions under which visibility matters. And when it is that one might make a claim to not be seen, and when it is that one might want to make a claim to be seen. So I think this relates to the emphasis that you place on circulation in particular, because for some reason in my mind, when I'm thinking of opacity and not being seen, that links for me, the right to opacity seems to be linked to the right to stay put, the right to not have to move, the right to sleep on the footpath, the right to maintain a space on the street where you can vend and sell samples, for example. Or in your example, the people who live behind the facade in this much more, what sounded in my mind at least like this amorphic space that wasn't visible from the street itself, the right to have a home there, to not have to be disturbed. So I'm just kind of curious how, what opacity means in these conditions. Just sort of speak more on that. And then the second has to do with this issue of redistribution, because I'm interested, I see what you're doing in part is to try to trouble a kind of standard resource-based consumption of redistribution, of moving possessions or resources or things from X to Y, and much more seeing it in this experimental realm of how it is that efficacious practices allow for a new experimental set of possibilities to emerge, and thinking of that in a redistributive sense. That was your first proposition as I kind of understood it. And my question is about the epistemology of redistribution, that is how we know when it is that a redistribution has taken place or not. Because it seems, right, if we're talking about politics that goes beyond specific interests and claims that aren't always fair, they aren't always just. They're not necessarily based on a shared identity. They're much more based on these opportunistic uses of relations between people. And that seems almost like redistribution is entropic. It has an almost entropic quality, things floating apart and going into motion in new ways. But I want to know kind of when we can say that this is an effective redistribution or when it is just things going apart. And I think that links to your claims about speculation, and that we can't ever know if this new opening up is effective or not until it happens. Right? You don't. When you speculate on something, you're hopeful that something will be achieved, but you don't ever know quite what it will be. But in your real estate narratives, one's speculating, but at the end it's very clear when the speculation was effective. There's a big profit concern. The building was constructed. The property was sold. In this case, though, I'm struggling to kind of visualize what the speculative redistribution might look like. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. I had a much more simple kind of idea in mind, which is, how do you maintain the kind of desire for some kind of intersection with others that you are in the city with, but that aren't like you, don't have the same job, and I guess for me, it is some sense, how do you keep that desire alive in some sense? People, how do you ward off the kind of fear of the poor, the fear that somehow you're being surrounded by all of these people who threaten to make your life miserable. In much of Jakarta, you don't have this kind of fear of the poor. It don't mean that you have dinner with them every night, but there's some sense that or you don't always talk, but they're a presence in your life, and even if it is sometimes a manipulative one, you still are in a close enough proximity to know each other, to see each other, to have some sense of dealing with each other. But yeah, the thing about redistribution, how do we know when there's been a significant redistribution or not is a great question. I'm not sure. The thing about opacity, let me just give you an example about what I mean by opacity. In a place, in a city like Jakarta, there's oftentimes a fear of big mobilization. There's a fear about the kind of agglomeration of particular kinds of actors that could act as a kind of collective force. So how do you manage to do that, again, without looking often as if you're doing it? For example, I did a lot of work in a big motorcycle repair and parts district, okay? So there's 100 shops, 100 outfits, all right next to each other. So someone comes in, all right? Someone comes in, bike comes in, stops at the first shop. He's thinking, all right, looks nice, it seems like well done and stuff, and it's usually guys. It's a guy business. Sorry, but the motorcycle is a guy business. So the guy says, oh, he's a customer. I might as well. Let me. Nice customer, might as well. But often that guy won't do it because he starts talking to the customer, like, what's your problem? Where are you coming from? Chats him up a little bit. He may find out that motorbike is not the motorbike of the guy, but the motorbike belongs to a pool at the company that guy works for. So there are 100 bikes. Okay. So the guy thinks, all right, now I can do this repair, but the guy down the street probably can do it a little bit better than I can. So I'm not going to take the guy's money. I'm not going to take the guy's business. I'm going to send this guy over to that other one because I want this guy to be really, really happy with what we do. Because I know that if this guy is really, really happy with what we do, it ain't one bike, but it's 100 bikes that we might be able to capture. So there's a sense that the decisions that are made by individual entrepreneurs in this district oftentimes have a sense of the interest of this district as a whole, in terms of where they refer people, how they move, how they pass things along, but in some sense, in a kind of opacity. Not done as a kind of official ethos, not done as a kind of announced practice, not done because you have the organization of motorcycle repairs and first part of the agenda is we need to capture that market, so that in some sense is what I'm talking about, the right to opacity, the way in which things can connect without seeming to have a kind of official agenda, official purpose. And part of this is how do these particular kinds of assemblages exert a kind of collective force, again without always seeming to do so, because they know that there are greater powers around than them and could make life very difficult for them and attenuate the kind of force that they do indeed recognize that they face.
May I suggest at this point that we continue the conversation downstairs so everyone can have something to drink and the conversation continue there? Professor Simone, Professor Fredericks, thank you so much for this.